peeps, welcome to another video. Today it is the 16 panel circle skirt tutorial, and I decided to do this probably 2 years ago now when I found the most amazing rainbow striped fabric in the local sewing shop, and I have been meaning to do another one and a tutorial ever since. But this skirt is fabric hungry. It is not an economical skirt to make in any way, shape or form. The one I'm wearing took 9 yards of fabric. Yep, 9 yards. Now if you're working with a wider fabric you might get away with less, but you definitely want to err on the side of caution when you're ordering your fabric for this skirt. You want to pick a fabric that you can get hold of some more if the worst happens, like it did to me, because I was cutting it out and I realised that I didn't have enough for the last 2 panels, which was so frustrating. But I'm so pleased with this skirt. I love how it's turned out and I really hope you enjoy this tutorial. So let's get started. For this tutorial you will need fabric with a definite straight stripe, satin bias binding, poly cotton bias binding, pins, scissors, matching zip, matching thread, a ruler and a French curve, pencil, string, interfacing. You're also going to need pattern making paper, a sewing machine and an iron and ironing board, all of which are far too large to put on this surface. Okay, now because I'm going to be dividing the skirt panels in half and in half again, I don't want there to be any seam allowance included in the measurements that are, or the initial measurements that I draft from. So I know my circumference because that's my waist measurement, so that's 28 inches, and that's including an inch of wearing ease. So my radius, which is the measurement I need to know, is 4.456. So I'm going to say that's 4.5 inches. So that's the measurement that I'm going to work with. And I'll put a link for this calculator into the description bar down below. Okay, so the first thing that you want to do is draw a straight line. So this is the straight edge of the paper, and I'm going to draw a straight line at a 90-degree angle from the straight edge. So I have a 90-degree angle here, and this is where I will be marking my 4.5 inches from. So with my soft tape measure I'm marking 4.5 inches along the line that I just drew. I've marked 4.5 inches down from this pivot point here, 4.5 inches down on the straight edge of the paper. Using the pivot point as the starting point, I'm going to do a couple more marks at 4.5 inches. I'm going to get really old school. I have my pencil and string, so I've got a couple of loops there, and I've basically just tied this string around the tip of the pencil. I'm then going to use this string to mark in my radius. So keeping the string straight, I've got the point of the pencil on the 4.5 inch mark, keeping the string taut and pressure on at the pivot point. I'm going to draw in my radius. I now need to work out how long I would like my skirt. For me personally, I like a midi skirt and I want mine to be 29 inches long. So I'm going to mark 29 inches from the start of my radius down to the edge of the paper, and then I'm going to do the same along this straight edge that I drew earlier. And it's got to be, so you have your 4.5 inch or your radius, and then you have your skirt length. So 4.5 inches for me, and then 29 this way, and then 4.5 inches this way for my radius, and then 29 inches this way. So I'm now going to mark a few reference points with my tape measure. So it's 29 inches starting at the radius, and I'm going to mark 29 inches, a few points along here so that I can use the string to join those dots up. Now if you have a giant compass that would work brilliantly, but I don't have even a little compass, which is why I'm using string. Make sure your tape measure is lying flat. So starting at the line you drew for your radius, And then we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to put the string on the end of the pencil. Got my string on the floor because then it's out of the way. So I've got the lead of my pencil on the 29-inch mark. I'm at the pivot point, so the 90-degree angle, keeping the string taut, keeping the pencil upright. I'm going to draw in my hemline. And those marks that I put in earlier should give me a guide if I'm getting close. And I am, so that's good. So this is 1/4 of a circle and it has no seam allowances at all in this. And that's why I didn't use the by hand London circle skirt generator, because they add 5 1/8 inch seam allowance onto this side and onto the waistband. And at the moment I don't want that because I now want to split this into panels for chevroning. So I need to divide it into 4 panels so that I will have a 16 panelled circle skirt. So I now need to divide this into 4. So half of 90 degrees is 45 and then half of 45 is 22.5. So I'm going to use my ruler. So I've lined up the straight edge of my ruler, and let's do this so that you can see. Okay, so it has a 45-degree angle marked on this ruler already. So I've lined that point of the 45-degree angle up with the pivot point on my circle skirt, and then made sure that this line was straight, and then I have made a mark where the 45-degree angle comes off. So now I'm using the pivot point as my start point, meeting up with that 45-degree mark there, and draw a straight line. So we've now got 2 panels of our circle skirt. We need to divide these in half again. So this is when a protractor would come in really useful. Mum and Dad and I have been sat in the other room trying to work out how this works. And yeah, protractors and compasses. I'm going to order myself a back to school set from Amazon. That'd be awesome. I don't have a protractor at the moment, so I can't work out what 22.5 degrees is. What I'm going to do is measure around this, and it is 7 inches. So we've got 3.5 inches at the 45-degree point, which is exactly what we want. And so half of 3.5 inches is... So I have this fraction calculator, and 1/4 of my panel is 3.5 inches. I want to divide that by 2, and that's 1 3/4 inches. So I'm going to make a mark 1 3/4 inches away from each of the side edges. So I'll show you what I mean. So again, using my soft tape measure on its side, laying it around the radius that we've drawn in, we want to mark down 1 3/4 inches. And then we want to do the same from the 45-degree angle that we've done there. So marked those 2 on, and again using the pivot point, the 90-degree angle in the corner, and then that line, that reference point that we just drew at 1 3/4 inches. I'm going to draw some more lines. So we have turned our 1/4 of a circle into 4 panels, which if you times that by 4, you will end up with 16 panels. None of these have seam allowances on them. Now, technically you really only need 2 of these panels to pattern this skirt. You can cut out more if you would like to, and I sometimes find that having more pattern pieces is useful because you can place them on the fabric and make sure that you have enough fabric to cut out what you want to cut out. But for purposes of this tutorial, I am only going to cut out these 2. This is all that we're going to need. We won't need these pieces, but this is just my way of drafting these 2 pieces accurately. So I'm going to cut these out, and then we need to add seam allowance to all of the sides. So we need to add seam allowance here here, 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 and up here at the waistband. And I find it helpful if you write down where you need to add your seam allowance on, and when you've done it you can cross it off. You should be able to tell when you've done it because you're going to need tape and extra paper, but I find it very helpful to add little seam allowance marks where I need to add that in. The next thing that you want to do is you want to label what each of these panel pieces is going to be. So this is going to be a 16 panel circle skirt, it's 28-inch waist which has 1 inch of ease in it. It's for me, and it is the 20th of June. And then this is going to be, so this is going to be basically with the stripes going one way, and then this is going to be with stripes going the other way. So it's going to be your front, your second front center. So that panel piece is going to be alternating, so it's not necessarily to put it down as a front or a back or a side, because it's going to be an alternating panel piece. So this could be panel piece 1 and that could be panel piece 2, and then that way you can remember which one you need to cut out which direction. Right, so I need to cut these two out, and then I need to add seam allowance to them, so I'm going to do that now. I'm not going to worry about notches on this because we're going to, with the chevrons, I'm going to be putting on, the way I like to work with stripes is I like to actually draw this, once I've placed the stripe for the first panel piece, I like to draw it on so that I can accurately place each piece from then, and then when we come to sew everything up it's going to be very obvious. You're going to need to match your stripes up, so it's going to be very obvious which piece goes where, so I'm not going to worry about notches for this particular pattern. I mean, technically you really only need one pattern piece and then just to place it differently on stripes, but I'm going to have two so that I can have one with stripes drawn on it going one way, one with stripes drawn on it going the other way, which will become obvious when I'm cutting things out, but I prefer to work with the two rather than just the one pattern piece. But technically you really do only need the one. Just cut it out 16 times. Okay, so I've cut them out, now I need to add seam allowance. Okay, so as I mentioned, I need to put seam allowance onto both edges and the waistband, so I'm just going to stick it down to a piece of paper with some tape and add on the 5/8 of an inch to those three sides. So using my French curve, lining up the cut edge with the 5/8 of an inch on the French curve, just draw in the seam allowance. Once you've drawn that in, you can then cut that out. If you don't want to be working with this much tape, because I know that I don't like putting pins through this much tape, you can always trace this pattern piece and then add the seam allowance to the traced one, which I'll show you in a second. Here we've got seam allowance to add it to pattern piece number 2. I'm going to trace pattern piece number 1 and show you that method. Okay, so the other option is that you can place the pattern piece that you've just drafted underneath tracing paper and trace it out and add the seam allowance that way. And that way you'll end up with a fresh pattern piece with no tape on it whatsoever, which is actually kind of nice for your pins. So I'm going to do that with this one. And I'm going to trace the original piece and then add the seam allowance because I don't want to jog the paper by accident and start adding extra bits here and there, just in case. So I like to trace the original and then add seam allowance. So again, just going to line up the 5/8 of an inch mark on my French curve with that line that I've just drawn, and add seam allowance the whole way down. Highly recommend that you don't use your French curve with a rotary cutter because you can trim bits off of it, as I've done here. I'm going to get myself a new French curve, as well as my protractor and compass. Okay, so so added the seam allowance onto everything. Going to transfer all of the markings to say what this is and cut it out, and then that is the pattern pieces drafted. Next will be cutting them out and working out how to get everything to chevron and behave itself. That's always fun. Okay, so the final thing that you're going to need to do is draft yourself a waistband. Now I've already drafted lots and lots of these, so I'm not going to do a new one, but I'm going to talk you through the process. Now I like my waistband to be 1.5 inches wide, so I have drawn a line 1.5 inches away from each other, and then you need to make this as long as your waist measurement plus the wearing ease that you've included. So mine is 28 inches with 1 inch of wearing ease. So this is a 28-inch long rectangle, which is 1.5 inches deep. So once you've drawn that out, you then need to add your chosen seam allowance. So I have used for this pattern 5/8 of an inch, so I have drawn 5/8 of an inch on both the top and the bottom and both of the short sides. And then I have written on all the details for this pattern piece. So we have a 16 panelled circle skirt. It also works as the 5-panel circle skirt, and this is the original pattern I've drafted it for. Put my name on it, the date that I drafted it, the size that I've drafted it, and the ease I've included. You need to cut 2 of these, and I've also included that I've got a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance on there. So that is your final pattern piece. Okay. So I have cut out 2 panels just to double check that I'm not mental and that it was going to work the way I imagined it to. And this is what you want to end up with it looking like. So the way that I have done that is, let's get the right thing on the right panel. That would help. Right, there we go. So there's this 45-degree angle on the quilting ruler, and you will need a 45-degree angle. You can use a protractor if you have one, and I'm going to be buying myself one. So what you want to do is take your 45-degree angle and you want to line that up with the edge of your pattern piece. And you can see here that I've drawn lots of lines on my pattern piece, and then I've written on them stripe, few, stripe, lots, because my fabric has different types of stripes. So stripe, few, stripe, lots, stripe, few, stripe, lots. That's just how I've identified it. On my other pattern, I'd done it by colour because that was the predominant pattern on the fabric. So you've got your 45-degree angle along the straight edge of your pattern, and you want to draw a line. Now, I placed my pattern piece down on the fabric so that it was the most economical use of it that I could get, so that I had the edge of my pattern piece as close to the edge of the fabric as I could. So I've ended up with this little stripe here. So I placed my pattern piece on the fabric in the most economical way possible. I then took my 45-degree line and I lined it up with actually one of the green stripes and made sure that my 45-degree line was going along the edge of my pattern piece, and then this straight edge of the ruler was going along the straight edge of one of the green stripes. So I drew a line, and once I'd drawn my line, I then pinned everything in place, and I then went over and drew in the lines of all the other stripes. And as I said, so I've written stripe, and this is lots, stripe, few, stripe, lots. So cut that out, and then for my matching pattern piece that's going to chevron, I then laid my matching pattern piece so that the top and the bottom were lining up. I took my ruler and the 45-degree angle, and I turned the ruler over. So I've done the 45-degree angle this way on this pattern piece and drawn a line, and then once I've matched this up, I've then turned the ruler over, got the 45-degree angle here, straight along the straight edge of my pattern piece. I've matched up the bottom of one stripe with this pattern piece, drawn a line, and then that way, when I put these all together, my fabric will chevron. So I need to cut 8 of these panels and 8 of these panels. And what I now like to do is I do use my pattern piece, but I also use the fabric that I've already cut to make sure that everything is lining up, and I'll show you that as I'm going. But I just wanted to show you how you get your chevrons onto your pattern pieces. So as you can see, this is definitely not an economical use of fabric, but it is a very, very pretty one. So if you have a stripe that you particularly like, I do recommend this type of skirt. And it works great as a skirt, or you can add it to a bodice, add a bodice to it to make it into a dress. So anyway, this is where those lines that we drew previously have come into play. So we've got here, this is the stripe, then that's the lots, stripe, few, lots, and as you can see, I've lined everything up. So I'm going to cut that out, and then I'm going to do the same all the way down the fabric so that I end up with a fairly decent sized piece there. So once I've cut the 8 panels this way, I'm then going to use the other side of the fabric to cut out the 8 panels that way. This is the most economical way that I can think of to cut it all out, because if I cut the other panel, it would be going across there and it would waste even more fabric. So I'm going to get on and get these cut out. So once you have your 16 panels cut out, you should have 8 of the chevron or the stripe going this way and 8 of the stripe going this way. You need to sew them together. Now, my stripe is not particularly even or regimented. It is quite a wavy one. So I'm going to sew mine together with French seams. However, if your stripe is very, very straight, dead straight, you may want to bind the edges or overlock the edges and then sew it together without using French seams, because you will have a little bit more control over the stripes matching, which is what I did with the rainbow fabric that I made my rainbow striped skirt out of. But because, like I say, these ones are slightly wavy, I think I'm gonna be able to get away with just French seaming it, which, I mean, you can match stripes with a French seam, that's not impossible. It's just giving yourself an extra layer of work that you may not wish to do. So what we need to do is sew one of these to one of these and then repeat that 8 times, and then we need to sew those panels together so that the stripes will chevron. So I'm going to sew one of these to one of these 8 times, end up with 8 more panels, and then I'll show you how I sew those panels together. Okay, so as I mentioned, I'm going to French seam mine, which means that I need to put the wrong sides together and sew at 1/4 inch for my first line of stitching. So that's what I've done here. I've got the wrong sides together, I've got the lines matching up, and I'm going to sew at 1/4 inch all the way down, and I'm going to do that with all of the 8 sections that I've pieced together. In fact, I have done that with all of the 8 sections that I've pieced together. So as you can see here, I've sewn at 1/4 inch with the wrong sides together. So the next step will be to trim these down in the French seaming process, but I'm actually going to join the panels together all the way around, and then when I get to trimming and seaming these again, I'll do it all in one go. So I'm going to sew this together at 1/4 inch. Okay, so as you can see, I've French seamed this, or I've started to French seam this together, so that's my 1/4 inch seam there. So you should end up with 8 panels that look like this. So we've got one set of 2 sewn together and another set of 2 sewn together. So the next thing that I'm going to do is sew those together down there, and I'm going to do that the whole way round. So I'm going to sew all 8 panels together the whole way round until I end up with a circle skirt. Obviously going to leave the back seam free because that I'm going to use bias binding on, but I will show you what this ends up looking like once I'm done. So again, wrong sides together of these 2 panels, matching up the stripes to create the chevrons. I've got all of my 16 panels sewn together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I am now going round and trimming the seam allowance by half, so it's down to 1/8 of an inch, so that I can fold it back on itself, press it, and then sew it with the final 3/8 of an inch that will create the French seam. So I've been doing that for all 16 panels, and I've ended up with lots of little ribbons of fabric left over. I've got 2 left to do, and once I've done that, no, sorry, 3 left to do. Yeah, 3 left to do. Once I've done those, I'm going to take them to the ironing board, fold them so the right sides are together, and press all of the seams in preparation for sewing the 3/8 of an inch seam that will finish the French seam. Have I said seam enough in that sentence? Right, so I have been over to the iron and I have pressed all of the seams that I've sewn and then trimmed. I've pressed them right sides together, and I'm now going around and I'm sewing them with the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, which will encase the raw edges and also give you your nice chevron on your stripes. So I have done about 4 so far, so I have 12 to go, working my way around slowly but surely. So once you have sewn all of your seams, you then need to press them. I've pressed mine all the way around this so that they're lying this way. I think you can just about see them there. So I've pressed them from the right side of the fabric, I've pressed them all the way over, and as you can see here, some of my chevrons are absolutely perfect and some are a little bit out, but if you stand back you get the overall impression of the chevron, which is what we were after. Now this is probably a good fabric for you to do your first one with, something that has a definite stripe but that is not a perfect stripe, because it means that you don't have to match up your points quite so perfectly, because you can't match your points up quite so perfectly, and as you can see you still get the wonderful chevron effect. It doesn't deteriorate from that whatsoever, but it also means that you don't need to panic about it being absolutely perfect, which is good for your very first go, unlike me who did it with a very definite and regimented stripe the first time round. So matching my points was an absolute nightmare. The way that I would recommend that you do that is just put pins in at the points that you want to match, so slowly and take your time. Okay, so once you've sewn all your panels together and you have pressed all of the seams flat, the next thing you need to do is finish the back seams. You can do this in any way that you like. You can overlock it, you can zigzag it, you can pink it. Personally, I am going to use bias binding. Yes, that's going to come as no surprise to anyone that's watched any of my videos. This stuff is my favourite, so I am going to use it on both the back seams, and I'm going to show you how I'm going to sew it on in just a sec. Okay, so I have the right side of the binding, so the folded edges are facing up, and I have that to the wrong side of the skirt, and I just pin the top to get me started so that this doesn't slip around too much. And what I'm going to do is sew in this crease, lining up this raw edge with this raw edge, backstitch at the start, sew all the way down to the bottom and backstitch again, and just keep, I don't pin mine in place, but you can definitely do that if you'd like to, just keeping this raw edge matching up with this raw edge and sewing in that crease. Once you've sewn on your bias binding, you should end up with something that looks like this. So line of stitching there, that's what it looks like from the right side. So the next thing you want to do is you want to top stitch fold this over, and again with one hand, this is interesting. So you're going to fold the bias binding over so it wraps around the raw edge, and you can see it on the right side of the fabric, and it's going to end up looking like this. Now you can just use your standard sewing machine foot to sew close to the edge to sew that down, but I like to use my blind hem foot because it has this guide here that I can run against the edge of the bias binding, which just means that I get a straighter line of stitching. Now there is an edge stitch foot. I don't have that one for my machine. My machine feet run around, start at about £27–28 per foot. So if I have one that does the job, I will make do with that one until I can afford to buy the correct foot. So this is a blind hem foot, and as I say, I use it because I like to run this guide up against the edge of the binding. I move my needle all the way over to the left and top stitch the binding down and I'll show you how I do that as I go. Okay, so my needle moved over to the left. So I like to, with this finger, I like to push this fabric down, and with this finger I like to push the bias binding down, and that way, and I run it all the way down the fabric like that as I'm sewing, and that way everything lies nice and flat. Once you're finished, you should end up with something that looks like this. So the next thing that we need to do is press it. Now you want to test and make sure that your iron is not too hot when you're pressing this, because you can melt this stuff. Again, ask me how I know. Right at the end of finishing a dress, I had to take loads of bits and pieces out to get to the binding that I'd ruined, and it was very frustrating. So test a piece with your iron first to make sure that you're not going too hot, but press it, and then we're going to attach the waistband. Okay, so the next thing you want to do is pin your waistband right side to right side of your skirt, and the way I've done this is I've quartered my waistband, and then I have counted, so I've got 4 panels there, 4 panels there, so this is the centre front, 4 panels there and 4 panels there. I'm now going to fill in the remaining gaps of and pin everything down so that it all lies nice and flat, and then I will be sewing it from the skirt side, because that's the side that's more likely to misbehave than this flat waistband. But I'll show you what I mean when I get to it. So I've got pin in at every seam, and as I said, I'm going to sew with the waistband down on the table and the skirt side up. If there's any fullness, I don't want to get any tucks or puckers in this side of the skirt, so I'm going to ease it out as I sew around, but we're going to use a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance the whole way around. Okay, so I have my waistband sewn on, everything is lying nice and flat, so what I need to go and do now is press this so that the seam allowance is all getting pressed up into the waistband. Press everything up into the waistband. Okay, the next thing that we need to do is put in our invisible zipper, and this is my preferred method and how I like to finish all of my skirts. So I have the top of the zip level with the top of the waistband, and we're using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I've actually erred a little bit further in because I've lost a little bit of weight since I drafted this pattern, and as it is, it was going to be a little bit loose on me, so I've just increased my seam allowance by a small amount. But you want to keep where you're sewing needs to be the seam allowance that you've included in your pattern away from the raw edge. So for this pattern it's 5/8 of an inch, but I'm going on 3/4 of an inch here. And I have on my invisible zipper foot, so it has 2 grooves in it that runs the coils of the zip out of the way so that you can stitch close to but not over the coils of the zip. So that's where you want to be stitching, is in here, but not too far over, because you might catch the coils, or you might make it so that you can't actually zip your zipper up and down. So I have my invisible zipper foot on, and I like to move my needle over 1 tick to the left when I'm sewing on the left hand side. That's the left hand side as you look at it from, so yeah, left hand side there. And then I move the needle over to the right when I'm doing the right hand side. So I'm going to back stitch at the top, sew all the way down to the bottom, zipper pull, back stitch, and then I'm going to show you how I make sure that I get my waistband lining up. So I've sewn this side down, I've then zipped the zip up, and I have used my friction marker to mark in where the waistband is, so that when I line up this side of the zipper on the other side of the skirt, I have a fair idea of where I need to be getting this mark to be sitting. So I'm going to do the same thing again. I'm going to line up the top of the tape with the top of the waistband on the other side, and then pin it so that this line intersects with the waistband on the other side as well. So I have the tape matching up of the zipper, matching up with the mark that I've put in, matching up with the waistline, and then also in line with the top, same seam allowance as I used on the other side. And I'm going to move my needle over to the right, still have my invisible zipper foot on, so I'm going to use the other side of the foot to fold back the coils, and back stitch at the start, so back stitch at the end. Okay, and so I have my invisible zipper installed. I've not pressed anything yet, but I'm going to do that next. And my chevrons are sort of meeting up, and again, I mean, this is the thing with this fabric, it's great and it's not, because some of my chevrons are perfect like this one, and then others are a bit squiffy, but that's because this stripe is not exactly straight, it does waver. But it does, again, makes things easier and you get the overall effect. So I'm really liking how this is turning out. So the next thing that I need to do is sew in the waistband facing lining piece, and I've prepped this. Now I've only got very lightweight interfacing, so I've actually interfaced both my waistband and my waistband facing. If you're using a firmer interfacing, you may only want to do the waistband itself. And the other thing I've done is I've turned up and pressed under, and this is 1/2 inch because we're using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, so I want to make sure that this is just a little bit larger, or yeah, so the waistband is a little bit larger than this one, so that when I stitch in the ditch around here, I'm definitely going to be catching this edge of my inner waistband. So the next thing that I want to do is I'm going to pin this waistband to this waistband all along the top and then sew it down at 5/8 of an inch. So I'll show you what I mean as I go. So I've got the waistband facing right sides together with the waistband pinned along the top, and I'm going to sew that at 5/8 of an inch the whole way along. Okay, so I have sewn the facing to the waistband at 5/8 of an inch. The next thing that we need to do is again press everything up, so up into the facing, because we're then going to understitch along that, close to that line of stitching that we've just done on the facing side, to make sure that the facing stays inside of the waistband. So we need to go press everything up and then we're going to understitch. So I've pressed everything up towards the waistband facing, and I'm now understitching, so that's stitching the waistband facing to all of the seam allowance, and that's as close to the line of stitching that we've previously done. And as I say, once we've pressed that, that will just ensure that the waistband facing stays inside and that the waistband stays nice and crisp. So I'm going to continue that line of stitching the whole way along. I've finished my understitching, and then I've gone and I've pressed the waistband facing down. As you can see here, there's a little bit of the outer waistband showing, and that's what you want, so I've pressed that the whole way along. So the next thing that we need to do is finish these edges and then also sew up the back seam of our skirt, and I'm going to use my regular zipper foot for doing that, and I'll show you how I do it all as we go. So this is what we want to be ending up with. So I have folded the waistband so that the right sides are together, and then using my regular zipper foot, I've run a line of stitching close to but not on top of the zipper teeth, and I'm now going to trim off this excess here because all of this bulk is going to be, we want a nice sharp point at the top of the waistband, so we don't want all this bulk here. And I think you can just about see it. So when I folded the waistband over so the right sides are together, I folded it so that I could see both lines of stitching on the right side, and that just helps make everything lie nice and flat. So I'm going to trim off the bulk, and I'm going to do that not looking in the viewfinder. I'm going to look at the actual project because, again, ask me how I know I've messed things up before. I'm going to trim off that excess there and take a little bit away from that as well. So we now need to turn this the right way round. So turn it through, give it a little pull on the zip. And once you've pressed that, you should have everything lying nice and flatly, and the zip is still usable because there's plenty of room between the fabric and the pull. So we need to do the same with the other side, so I'm going to show you right from the start. So you have your zip installed, you've got your waistband facing on, your understitching done. So what you want to do is fold the facing right sides to the outer waistband, fold it all over, and you want to be able to see both of those lines of stitching. You're then going to pin that in place, and then we're going to run a line of stitching close to the teeth but not right up to the teeth from there and back stitching here, trim off all the excess and turn it around. So line of stitching, trim off the excess, don't cut into that line of stitching that you've just done. I'm going to trim off a little bit of this extra as well, get those out of the way, then turn this around on itself, pull my zip, there we go, that's from the front, and there we go. Oh, out of focus. There we go. From the back and from the front. So, fingers crossed when we zip this up. Everything meets up nice. Oh, and random pattern matching. Awesome. So again, I haven't pressed this as yet, but it will all lie much flatter once I have pressed it. So we still have to sew down this part of the waistband, but whilst we have our zipper foot attached, I'm going to sew up the back seam of the skirt. So with your zip closed, you want to pin the back seam of the skirt with this part of the zip out of the way. You want to pin it all the way down to the hem, and then with the needle, with your regular zipper foot on and your needle all the way over to the right, you're going to overlap the stitching. You won't be able to get right up to this stitching, but you're going to get as close as possible, and you're going to overlap by a couple of millimeters, back stitch and stitch all the way down to the hem of the skirt, and make sure that you keep all of this zipper out of the way because you don't want to catch that. So that's going to be the next thing I do. So you can see there, a couple of millimeters away from the original line of stitching that's securing the zipper in, I've overlapped that by a couple of millimeters or 1/4 of an inch, and I have then sewn down to the hem of the skirt. And for my machine, I had the needle all the way over on the right hand side of my regular zipper foot. So I'm now going to go and press this open and press all the way up to the top so that I can then finish off the waistband. Okay, next up we need to sew down the facing of the waistband. Now you can do that by hand if you would like to, but I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So I have run a line of pins along the seam that attaches the waistband to the skirt, and on the inside I have made sure that that has caught the waistband facing all the way across, and I'm going to stitch in the ditch, which is literally what it sounds like. You are going to run a line of stitching right in that crease that is made by the seam of the waistband where it attaches to the skirts, and you're going to run a line of stitching all the way around the waistband, securing it down. So once you've done your stitching in the ditch, you should end up with something that looks like this from the front and that from the back, and that just means that your waistband is all now neatly finished. Very last thing that we need to do is hem our skirt. Now I am going to use bias binding, but I'm actually going to use this poly cotton bias binding. So I use this satin one for the back seam because this is nice and soft and quite flexible, and I use this for the majority of my dressmaking. But when I first started, I basically just bought bias binding from eBay, and it was poly cotton, and as you can see, this is really stiff in comparison to this stuff, so very stiff. But the thing that I like about this is that it means that it gives the hem of skirts more body. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to sew bias binding to the hem of my skirt, and I'm going to sew it with, this time I'm going to sew it with the right side of the binding, so the folded edge of the binding to the right side of the skirt, and I'm going to match up the edges, the raw edges, and I'm going to sew in that ditch there. Now that is obviously going to give, and then I'll turn everything onto the inside. So when you're working with circle skirts, the circumference of the skirt hem is going to be greater than what you're turning it up in two. So the smaller amount that you can turn up, the easier it will be for you. There are many ways that you can do this. You can run a line of gathering stitches and gently pull on those. You can do a narrow rolled hem on here, but I personally prefer to use bias binding with a small folded edge like this. And as I say, also this one with the stiffness will give the skirt a nice kick. I mean, this is a big skirt anyway, it's a full circle skirt, but this will give it just that extra kick and ripple at the bottom, which is what I'm after. So I'll show you how I'm going to pin this on, but it's going to be just as I described. So right side of binding to right side of fabric. So I have the right side of the binding to the right side of the fabric. I have folded back about 1 inch on itself, and I'm going to start by sewing over that, and then when I get round to the other end I'm just going to overlap, bind up about another 1 inch, and that's going to finish off the edges of the binding for me neatly. And as I say, I'm just going to match this raw edge with the raw edge of the skirt and stitch in the ditch. Now if you're using a drapier fabric than I am, you may wish to hang your circle skirt up and see if the hem wants to misbehave and drop, but fingers crossed, with this quilting cotton and my previous experience, I haven't had to worry about that. So I'm going to go ahead and hem my skirt now. If you see me rehemming this in a couple of weeks on the vlog, then you know I am an idiot, but fingers crossed this was going to work out. Okay, so I have overlapped the starting point by about 1 inch, and that means that that's just going to be a nice clean finish on the inside. So what I'm going to do now is press all of this around to the inside again, with doing this with one hand, so that it kind of, so I want a small amount of the fabric showing at the bottom here, so 1/8 of an inch all the way around. But I'm going to press that up and then stitch it down by hand, but I'm going to do the stitching by hand a bit later this evening in front of the TV, but I'd like to get it pressed so that I can do that. Okay, so I'm hemming the skirt and I have got white thread and my needle. So I have gone into the bias binding, into the crease of that, and I'm going to go in about 1 inch and pull the thread through, and then I'm going to take a couple of strands from the fabric, make a stitch, and then it's into the bias binding for just about 1 inch, and then just repeat that process. So small bite of the fabric, crease of the bias binding, and do that the whole way around, and then you end up with a lovely hem. And with this binding as well, you'll end up with some body in the hem. So that's your skirt finished. This skirt is definitely a fabric hungry monster, but it is really, really beautiful. If you decide to make your skirt a little bit shorter, you could definitely cut the panels out on the same piece of fabric, and especially if you're using a wider fabric than the quilting cotton that I'm using. But having said all of that, I am so pleased with this skirt. I really, really love it. I think it's really effective, and as you all know, I love this length and I love circle skirts, so I shall be wearing this one a lot. The other thing I would say is that the very first one I made had a very regimented and straight stripe. This one, whilst the stripes look straight, they are definitely different sizes, which it actually works in your favour, because you don't have to be so precise with the matching up of the chevrons as you would be with a very regimented stripe. So there's also that to bear in mind when you're picking your fabrics. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you have any questions at all, let me know in the comment section down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. If you have enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!